The door to the boarding house swung open with such force that the oil lamps flickered, and Juliana Kensington's heart nearly stopped when she saw the blood spreading across the stranger's shoulder like spilled wine on white linen. It was May of 1882, and Stillwater, Oklahoma Territory had been quieter than usual until that moment. Juliana had been running the boarding house for 3 years since her father died, cooking meals for travelers and ranch hands who needed a place to rest between cattle drives. She had learned to move efficiently, to anticipate needs, to serve without being asked. So when the tall cowboy stumbled through her door, his face pale beneath weeks of trail dust, she jumped up from where she had been mending linens, already reaching for the basin of water she kept ready. "Sit down. Let me help you," she said, her voice steady despite the way her hands wanted to shake. She had seen injuries before, plenty of them in a territory where doctors were scarce and trouble was common. But something about this man made her want to help him more desperately than she could explain. "No, madam," the cowboy said, and despite the obvious pain etched into his features, his voice carried a warmth that stopped her in her tracks. "I am not bleeding all over your clean floors while you wait on me. Just point me to where I can clean up and I will manage." Juliana opened her mouth to protest, but he was already shaking his head, one hand pressed against the wound. His eyes, she noticed, were the color of creek water in summer, green, brown, and clear despite his obvious exhaustion. "Please," she insisted, moving toward him with the basin. "You are injured and this is my house. Let me help you." The cowboy swayed slightly, then seemed to reconsider his stubbornness. "All right, but only if you tell me where your kitchen is. Once you patch me up, I am cooking dinner. You have been working all day, I can see it in your face." "That is ridiculous," Juliana said, but she found herself almost smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "You have been shot. Grazed," he corrected, lowering himself carefully into the chair she pulled out for him. "And I have cooked through worse. Made beans over a campfire with a broke rib once. This is nothing." As Juliana carefully peeled back his shirt to examine the wound, she tried to focus on the injury rather than the way her heart seemed to be beating louder than it should. The bullet had indeed grazed him, cutting a painful line across his upper shoulder but missing anything vital. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with steady hands while he sat remarkably still. "I am Xavier Vaughn," he said after a long moment of silence broken only by the sound of water wringing from cloth. "I used to work the cattle ranches near the Cimarron River, but I have been drifting the past few months." "Juliana Kensington," she replied, threading her needle with practiced efficiency. "This will hurt." "Everything does eventually," Xavier said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up and meet his eyes. Pain lived there, not just physical but something deeper. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in her own reflection some mornings. She stitched quickly but carefully, and true to his word, Xavier barely flinched. When she finished bandaging the wound, he stood up despite her protests and rolled his shoulder experimentally. "Where is that kitchen?" he asked. "You need to rest," Juliana argued, but he was already moving toward the back of the house with the confidence of someone who knew his way around a home even if it was not his own. "You have 4 other boarders here. I saw their things," Xavier said, glancing back at her with something that might have been amusement in his eyes despite the pain that still tightened his jaw. "And you were planning to cook for all of them plus yourself. Sit down, Miss Kensington. Tonight I cook." There was something about the way he said it, firm but kind, that made Juliana find herself actually sitting down at her own kitchen table for the first time in months. She watched as Xavier moved through her kitchen with surprising grace, finding the flour and salt pork, the dried beans she had been soaking, the cornmeal and the cast iron skillet without needing to ask where anything was kept. How did you know where everything was? She asked, genuinely curious. My mother ran a boarding house in Missouri before the war, Xavier said, his hands moving with the confidence of long practice as he began mixing cornbread batter. I grew up cooking for crowds. After she died, I went west, but you never forget how to do this kind of work. It is in your bones. Juliana watched him work, fascinated by the contradiction he presented. Here was a man who obviously lived a rough life, judging by the calluses on his hands and the way he moved like someone always ready for trouble. Yet he handled eggs with the gentleness of someone who understood the value of things that could break. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "Who shot you?" Xavier was silent for a moment, his hands stilling over the skillet. "3 men tried to rob me about 5 miles outside of town. They thought a lone rider would be easy pickings. They were wrong about that, but one of them got lucky with a shot before they decided I was more trouble than I was worth. I kept riding until I saw lights, and your place was the first building I came to. Are they still out there?" Juliana felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the kitchen. "I do not think they will follow. They were already hurt and spooked when they ran off." Xavier resumed his cooking, sliding the cornbread into the oven with practiced ease. "But I will sleep light tonight just in case. And I will be gone in the morning so I do not bring you any trouble." "You could stay," Juliana heard herself say, and immediately felt her cheeks flush. "I mean, until you heal properly. The wound needs time to close and you should not be riding hard for at least a few days." Xavier turned to look at her fully, and Juliana felt the weight of his gaze like something physical. "I would not want to impose." "You are cooking dinner in my kitchen," Juliana said, trying to sound practical rather than hopeful. "I think we are past worrying about imposing. Besides, I could use help around here. The last ranch hand who was boarding here left 2 weeks ago and there is work that needs doing. Fence repairs, wood chopping, things that are difficult for me to manage alone." It was not entirely true. Juliana had managed alone for 3 years and could continue doing so. But something about Xavier Vaughn made her want him to stay, made her want to know more about the sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes and the gentleness in his hands, despite the violence he had clearly faced. "All right," Xavier said slowly. "A few days, until the wound closes, and I will earn my keep." The other boarders arrived as the sun was setting, and Juliana introduced Xavier as a new temporary resident who had been kind enough to prepare dinner. The men, ranch hands and drifters themselves, accepted his presence without question. That was the way of places like Stillwater, where people came and went like tumbleweeds, and asking too many questions was considered impolite. Xavier served the meal he had prepared with the same quiet competence he had shown in making it. The cornbread was perfect, golden and moist. The beans were seasoned with exactly the right amount of salt pork and molasses. He had even managed to make a simple gravy that turned the basic meal into something that reminded Juliana of Sunday dinners from her childhood. After the other men had retired to their rooms, Juliana found Xavier washing dishes despite her protests. "You already cooked," she said, picking up a towel to dry. "This is too much." "My mother used to say that a job is not done until the cleaning is finished," Xavier replied, his hands deep in the soapy water. "Besides, you stitched me up and gave me a place to stay. This is the least I can do." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and Juliana found herself acutely aware of how close they were standing, how his shoulder nearly brushed hers every time he handed her a clean plate. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to share space with someone, to move in rhythm with another person through simple domestic tasks. "Why are you here?" Xavier asked suddenly. "A woman like you, running a boarding house in the middle of the territory. You should be somewhere safer, somewhere with more opportunities. Juliana considered the question carefully as she dried a bowl. My father bought this property in '79, right after the land run. He wanted to build something, to be part of something new. When he died, I kept it going because it was what he wanted, and because leaving felt like giving up on his dream. That is a heavy burden to carry for someone else's dream, Xavier said gently. Maybe, Juliana admitted, but it became my dream too, somewhere along the way. I like feeding people, giving them a clean place to rest. I like being part of this town, watching it grow. Stillwater was barely anything when we first came here. Now we have a general store, a church, even talk of a school. I helped build that in my own small way. Xavier nodded slowly, understanding crossing his features. I have been drifting since my mother died. Working cattle, taking odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I thought that was what I wanted, to be free of obligations and expectations. But lately, I have been wondering if I was running away rather than running toward anything. Juliana set down her towel and turned to face him fully. What are you running from? Memories, mostly, Xavier said, meeting her eyes. My mother died slowly, painfully. I took care of her for 2 years, watched her fade away piece by piece. When she finally passed, I just started moving. I told myself I was looking for work, for opportunity. But really, I just could not stand being in one place long enough for grief to catch up with me. The honesty in his words struck something deep in Juliana's chest. I understand that. When my father died, I threw myself into this place. I worked from dawn until I collapsed at night, took in every boarder who needed a room, cooked enough food for twice as many people as were actually here. It took me a year before I could sit still without feeling like I was drowning in sadness. Xavier reached out and gently touched her hand where it rested on the counter. It was a brief contact, barely a moment, but Juliana felt it like electricity running through her entire body. Thank you for telling me that, he said quietly, and for letting me stay. Thank you for cooking, Juliana replied, her voice softer than she intended, and for making me sit down. I cannot remember the last time someone took care of me like that. They finished the dishes together, and when Juliana showed Xavier to one of the spare rooms upstairs, she found herself lingering in the doorway longer than necessary, reluctant to end the evening even though exhaustion pulled at her bones. Good night, Xavier, she said finally. Good night, Juliana, he replied, and the way he said her name made her heart skip in a way she had not felt in years. The next morning, Juliana woke before dawn as usual, but when she came downstairs, she found Xavier already in the kitchen with coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in the pan. His bandage was clean, which meant he had changed it himself, and though he moved a bit stiffly, he seemed in good spirits. I thought we agreed you would rest, Juliana said, but there was no real reproach in her voice. I rested all night, Xavier replied, pouring her a cup of coffee and handing it to her with a slight smile. Now I am earning my keep like I promised. Sit down and drink that before it gets cold. It became a pattern over the next few days. Xavier would wake early and start breakfast, refusing to let Juliana work until she had eaten and had at least 1 cup of coffee. Then they would work together through the day, him taking on the heavier tasks that she normally struggled with while she managed the cooking and cleaning that kept the boarding house running. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together, their movements becoming more synchronized as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. Xavier repaired the fence that had been leaning precariously for months. He chopped enough wood to last through the next winter. He fixed the door on the barn that had been hanging crooked and reinforced the steps leading up to the porch that had started to sag. And through it all, he talked to Juliana, sharing stories of his life on the cattle ranches and the places he had drifted through. Juliana found herself sharing too, telling him about her childhood in Kansas, about the excitement and terror of the land run, about the first year in Stillwater when everything had been tense and makeshift shelters and big dreams. She told him about her father's belief that Oklahoma Territory would become something great, and about how she was trying to honor that belief by making her small corner of it a place of warmth and welcome. On the fourth day, Juliana was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard raised voices from the front of the house. She dropped the sheet she was holding and hurried around the building, her heart pounding with sudden fear. 3 men on horseback were stopped in front of the boarding house, and Xavier was standing on the porch, his posture relaxed but ready. Even from a distance, Juliana could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested casually near where his gun would be if he were wearing it. "We are just passing through," one of the men was saying, and Juliana recognized the defensive aggression in his voice. "Thought we would stop for a meal." "The boarding house welcomes paying customers," Xavier said calmly. "But if you 3 are the same men who tried to rob a rider last week, you should probably keep moving." The man who had spoken shifted in his saddle, and Juliana saw his hand move toward his gun. Without thinking, she grabbed the rifle she kept by the back door and walked around to stand beside Xavier, the weapon held with clear competence if not quite pointed at the men. "This is my property," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And if you start trouble here, the sheriff will hear about it. He happens to be my godfather, and he takes a dim view of people threatening his family." It was a bluff. The sheriff was a fair man but no relation to her. But the men did not know that, and the sight of a woman with a rifle who clearly knew how to use it seemed to change their calculation of risk versus reward. "No trouble," the first man said, raising his hand slowly. "Like I said, just passing through." They turned their horses and rode off at a pace just short of a run, and Juliana let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Xavier turned to look at her with something like admiration in his eyes. "You are full of surprises, Miss Kensington," he said. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, Juliana replied, lowering the rifle now that her hands were starting to shake with delayed fear. "He said a woman alone in the territory needed to be able to protect herself." "He was a wise man," Xavier said, and then, more softly, "You did not have to come out here. They might have shot you." "They might have shot you," Juliana countered. "You were not even wearing your gun." "I did not want to escalate things," Xavier explained. "Sometimes standing your ground without a weapon makes men think twice. If I had been armed, they might have felt like they had to prove something." Juliana nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as the fear was slowly transforming into something else, something that felt almost like anger. "They were the ones who shot you." "I know," Xavier said. "I recognize the bay horse, but they are gone now, and I do not think they will come back, not after facing down both of us." They went back inside together, and Juliana made tea with hands that only trembled slightly. Xavier sat across from her at the kitchen table, and the silence between them was weighted with things neither quite knew how to say. "I should probably move on," Xavier said finally. "I do not want to bring more trouble to your door." "You are not the trouble," Juliana said sharply. "Those men are the trouble, and they would have found their way here eventually whether you were here or not. At least with you here, I had backup." Xavier smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. "Backup, I like that. Makes me feel useful." "You are useful," Juliana said, and then, because the fear was still making her reckless with her honesty, "I do not want you to go." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple appreciation for help around the boarding house. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I do not want to go either," he admitted. "I have been here less than a week, but I feel more at home than I have felt anywhere in the past 5 years. You make me feel like maybe I could stop running. Like maybe the grief will not catch up and drown me if I stand still for a while." Juliana squeezed his hand, her heart doing that strange skipping thing it seemed to do whenever he was near. "I think grief is always there. We do not outrun it or outlast it. We just learn to carry it alongside everything else. The love we still have, the hope for tomorrow, the small moments of joy we find in unexpected places. Is this one of those moments?" Xavier asked, and there was vulnerability in his eyes that made Juliana want to protect him from whatever had hurt him, even though she knew that pain was in the past and beyond her reach. "Yes," she said simply. "This is one of those moments." Xavier stood and walked around the table, drawing her up to face him. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she could feel the warmth of him despite the careful inches of space he maintained between them. "Juliana," he said, her name soft as a prayer. "I know it has only been a few days. I know I am just a drifter with nothing but a horse and the clothes on my back, but I think I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that before anything else happens." Juliana felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came with overwhelming emotion rather than sadness. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And I do not care that it has only been a few days. Sometimes you just know." Xavier cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had spilled over. "May I kiss you, please?" Juliana said, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and warm and tasting faintly of the coffee they had shared that morning. The kiss started soft but deepened as Juliana wrapped her arms around his waist, pulling him closer despite the bandage on his shoulder. Xavier made a small sound against her mouth, part pleasure and part pain, and she immediately pulled back. "I hurt you," she said, mortified. "Worth it," Xavier replied, grinning despite the way he was carefully rolling his shoulder. "Completely worth it, though maybe we should be more careful until this heals properly." They spent the rest of the day in a haze of new love, stealing glances and brief touches as they went about their work. When the other boarders came in for dinner, Juliana was certain her feelings must be written all over her face, but the men were too focused on their food to notice or comment. That night, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, Xavier and Juliana sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The Oklahoma night was warm and full of cricket song, and Juliana felt more at peace than she could remember feeling in years. "Tell me about your dreams," Xavier said, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against his good side. "Not your father's dreams, but yours." Juliana thought about it carefully. "I want this place to be more than just a boarding house. I want it to be a real home, the kind where people feel safe and welcomed. I want to have a family someday, children who grow up knowing they are loved and secure. I want to watch Stillwater grow from a rough territory town into a proper community with schools and churches and families. I want to be part of building something that lasts." "Those are good dreams," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "What if I told you I wanted to be part of them?" Juliana turned to look up at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have spent 5 years running from grief and loneliness, and in less than a week, you have given me a reason to stop running. I am saying that I want to stay here with you and help you build all those dreams. I am saying that I love you, Juliana Kensington, and if you will have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." "But you barely know me," Juliana protested weakly, even as hope bloomed fierce and bright in her chest. "I know that you are strong and kind," Xavier said. "I know that you stood up to 3 armed men to protect me. I know that you work yourself to exhaustion taking care of others. I know that you carry your grief with grace and your dreams with determination. I know that when you smile, really smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a storm." "What else do I need to know?" Juliana kissed him then, putting all her hope and fear and love into the contact. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she said, "Yes. Stay. Please stay. I love you too, Xavier Vaughn, and I want you to be part of my life and my dreams and everything I am building here." They sat together on the swing until late into the night, making plans and sharing more stories, weaving their separate histories into a shared future. Xavier told her about his dream of having horses, really training them rather than just breaking them for ranch work. Juliana told him about her hope of expanding the boarding house, maybe adding more rooms or even building a separate stable for guests' horses. Over the next few weeks, Xavier's shoulder healed and his presence in the boarding house became permanent. He moved his few possessions into Juliana's room, and they began living as a couple even before they made it official. The other boarders accepted the change without comment, and the town of Stillwater gradually came to know Xavier as Juliana's man, the steady cowboy who had settled down with the boarding house lady. In July, they were married by the circuit preacher who came through Stillwater once a month. It was a simple ceremony in the small church, with half the town in attendance because everyone loved Juliana and was happy to see her find love. She wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue calico, and Xavier wore his cleanest shirt and a new vest he had purchased specially for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance sighed audibly. The boarding house thrived under their joint management. Xavier built a proper stable and began buying horses to train, creating a second source of income that eased the financial pressure on Juliana. She expanded her menu and her reputation, and soon the boarding house was known throughout the territory as the best place to get a hot meal and a clean bed between Kansas and Texas. But more than the business success, what mattered was the life they built together. Xavier made good on his promise to cook dinner at least once a week, usually on Sundays when Juliana was most exhausted from the week's work. He would shoo her out of the kitchen with gentle firmness, insisting she rest while he prepared a meal that always somehow tasted of love and care as much as salt and seasoning. Juliana learned to lean on him, to accept help without feeling like she was admitting weakness. Xavier learned to stay in one place, to put down roots and invest in a future instead of always keeping one eye on the horizon. They learned each other's habits and quirks, the way long married couples do, until they moved together through their days like two parts of a well-oiled machine. In the spring of 1883, Juliana discovered she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening after dinner, when they were sitting together on the porch swing that had become their special place. He had been talking about buying another mare to expand his breeding program when she interrupted him with a hand on his arm. "Xavier, I need to tell you something," she said, and something in her voice made him stop mid-sentence and turn to give her his full attention. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" The concern in his eyes was immediate and genuine. "I am fine," Juliana said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Better than fine. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Xavier stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that looked like awe. Then he laughed, a sound of pure happiness, and pulled her into his arms as carefully as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby. Juliana, that is wonderful. That is the best news I have ever heard." "You are happy?" Juliana asked, even though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Xavier said, pulling back enough to cup her face and kiss her thoroughly. "I am grateful. I am blessed. I am terrified that I will somehow mess this up because I never had a father to show me how to do it right. But mostly, I am just overwhelmingly happy." "You will be a wonderful father," Juliana assured him, covering his hands with hers. "I have seen how gentle you are with the horses, how patient and kind. You will be the same with our child." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat of Oklahoma was oppressive, and Juliana struggled with exhaustion and nausea that made cooking difficult. But Xavier stepped up without complaint, taking over more of the boarding house work and hiring a local girl to help with the cleaning. He was protective to the point of being overprotective, constantly worried that Juliana was doing too much or not resting enough. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Juliana reminded him one afternoon when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. "I know," Xavier said, taking the basket anyway, "but you are precious to me and so is the life you are carrying. Let me take care of you, please." How could she argue with that? So Juliana learned to accept even more help, to let Xavier and the girl they had hired shoulder the burden of the daily work while she focused on growing the baby that seemed to take all her energy. In December, during a cold snap that was unusual for Oklahoma, Juliana went into labor. Xavier stayed with her through the entire ordeal, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her she was strong. She was amazing. She could do this. When the baby finally arrived after 12 hours of labor, it was a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Xavier's father, who had died in the war before Xavier was old enough to remember him. Thomas Vaughn came into the world screaming his displeasure at the cold and the brightness, but he quieted the moment. Juliana held him against her chest, as if he knew instinctively that he was safe and loved. Xavier held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, all his earlier fears apparently forgotten in the face of overwhelming love. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I promise I will do everything I can to be worthy of you." The boarding house had to close for a week while Juliana recovered, which was the longest it had ever been shut down. But the people of Stillwater understood, and when it reopened, half the town came by to leave gifts for the baby and congratulations for the new parents. Being parents changed everything and nothing. The work was harder, the sleep more scarce, but Xavier and Juliana fell into new rhythms that accommodated their son. Xavier would walk the floor with Thomas at night when he was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until the baby settled. Juliana would nurse him in the rocking chair Xavier had made specially for that purpose, watching the Oklahoma sunrise through the window and feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. Thomas grew from a squalling infant into a curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with the horses and mimicking Xavier's careful, gentle manner with the animals. Xavier taught him to be kind to all living things, to work hard, to be honest and fair. Juliana taught him to read using her father's old books, to appreciate good food and warm hospitality, to see the value in making a home. In 1885, Juliana became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier because she knew what to expect and was better at accepting help. Their daughter was born in May, during a spring rainstorm that broke a long drought. They named her Sarah, and she had Juliana's practical nature and Xavier's quiet intensity. The boarding house continued to thrive, and Xavier's horse training operation grew into something that drew buyers from as far away as Kansas City. Stillwater itself grew from a rough frontier town into an established community, just as Juliana's father had dreamed. A proper school was built, then a second church, then a bank and a hotel that competed with but never quite surpassed the reputation of Juliana's boarding house. Through it all, Xavier and Juliana built a life that was rich in love if not always easy. There were hard years when drought killed the crops and money was tight. There were losses, like when Juliana's godfather, the sheriff, died of a heart attack, or when one of Xavier's favorite mares broke her leg and had to be put down. There were arguments because no marriage is perfect, about money and work, and how to raise the children and whose family they should visit for Christmas. But through everything, they had each other. They had the memory of that first night when Juliana had jumped up to serve him the moment he walked in, and Xavier had said, "Sit down. Tonight I will cook." They had the foundation of that early recognition that they were meant to be together, that their separate griefs and dreams had been leading them toward each other all along. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Juliana to the territorial fair in Oklahoma City, leaving the children with a trusted friend for the weekend. It was a rare indulgence, time alone together without the demands of the boarding house or the children or the horses. They walked through the fair hand in hand, eating candy apples and watching the shows, feeling young and carefree in a way they rarely did anymore. That night, in the hotel room they had splurged on, Xavier pulled Juliana into his arms and said, "Do you ever regret it? Tying yourself to a drifter who stumbled into your boarding house half dead?" Juliana looked up at him, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the eyes that still made her heart skip when they looked at her with love. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I dreamed of and things I did not even know to dream about. You gave me a partner, a family, a life full of love and purpose. How could I ever regret that?" "I love you," Xavier said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I loved you the moment you tried to help me despite being terrified. I loved you more when you stood beside me with that rifle. I loved you completely when you said yes to my crazy proposal after less than a week. And I love you more every single day we have together." "I love you too," Juliana replied, pulling him closer. "Thank you for walking through my door. Thank you for staying. Thank you for making me sit down and let you cook. Thank you for teaching me that accepting help does not make me weak, and that love can be strong enough to build a life on." They made love that night with the tenderness of long practice and the passion of people who still desired each other deeply after years of marriage. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, they talked about their dreams for the future. More horses for Xavier to train. Maybe converting part of the boarding house into a proper restaurant for Juliana. College for Thomas and Sarah when they were old enough. Grandchildren someday, though that was still years away. The years continued to pass, marked by the small moments and large that make up a life. Thomas grew into a young man who combined his father's way with horses and his mother's head for business. Sarah became a teacher, taking a job at the Stillwater School and later marrying a doctor who set up practice in town. Xavier's hair turned gray at the temples, and Juliana noticed lines around her eyes that had not been there before, but they both wore the marks of time with pride because they had earned them together. In 1895, when Oklahoma Territory was preparing for eventual statehood, the boarding house celebrated its 16th year of operation under Juliana's management. It had become an institution in Stillwater, the place where territorial officials stayed when they came through town, where ranch owners met to negotiate cattle prices, where travelers could always find a warm welcome and an excellent meal. Xavier had expanded his horse operation to include a small riding school, teaching the children of Stillwater's growing population how to ride and care for their horses. He was known throughout the territory as a fair dealer and an excellent trainer, and his horses commanded premium prices at market. But for all their professional success, what Xavier and Juliana valued most was the life they had built together. The boarding house was more than a business. It was a home filled with love and laughter, where their children had grown up and where their grandchildren now visited. The stable was not just where Xavier worked. It was where he found peace and purpose, where he channeled all the restless energy that had once kept him drifting into something productive and lasting. On a warm evening in June of 1898, Xavier and Juliana sat together on their porch swing, just as they had on countless other evenings over the past 16 years. Their children were grown and living their own lives, though both still in Stillwater. The boarding house had guests who were managing fine without constant supervision. The horses were settled for the night. It was one of those rare, perfect moments of peace. "You ever think about that first night?" Juliana asked, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. "When you stumbled in bleeding and then insisted on cooking dinner?" "All the time," Xavier admitted, his arm tightening around her. "I think about how close I came to riding past your place, to maybe bleeding out somewhere in the dark. I think about how my whole life changed in the span of one evening, how I went from being alone and directionless to having everything I needed right in front of me. I think about how you made me sit down," Juliana said softly. "How you saw that I was exhausted and lonely even though I was trying to hide it. How you cared enough to help me even when you were hurt and had every right to just collapse. That was when I started falling in love with you, I think. When I realized you saw me as a person worth caring for, not just someone to serve you." Xavier turned to kiss her temple, a gesture so familiar and sweet that it made Juliana's heart swell. "You are worth caring for. You are worth everything. And I will spend the rest of my life grateful that I walked through your door that night." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over Stillwater, over the town that had grown up around them and that they had helped build. The boarding house behind them was full of life and warmth, exactly what Juliana had dreamed of creating. The stable beside it held horses that Xavier had trained with patience and love. Their children were happy and settled. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving. "We did it," Juliana said quietly. "We built something that lasts." "We did," Xavier agreed. "Together. And we are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us, more dreams to chase, more memories to make. More dinners for you to cook while I sit down and rest," Juliana teased. Xavier laughed, the sound still making her heart flutter after all these years. "Always. I will always make you sit down when you need to rest. I will always cook for you when you are tired. I will always take care of you, Juliana, because that is what love is. Seeing what someone needs and doing everything in your power to provide it. Then I will always patch your wounds and stand beside you with a rifle when trouble comes," Juliana replied. "I will always believe in your dreams and help you chase them. I will always love you with everything I have, because you taught me that accepting love is not weakness, it is strength." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Xavier and Juliana remained on their swing, wrapped in each other's arms and in the life they had built together. The boarding house stood solid and welcoming behind them, a testament to hard work and dedication. The stable beside it represented dreams realized and new ones still forming. And everywhere, in every corner of their property and their lives, was the evidence of a love that had started with a simple act of kindness and had grown into something extraordinary. Their story was not dramatic in the way of legends or dime novels. There were no shootouts or dramatic rescues, No fortunes won or lost. It was simply the story of two lonely people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose every day to keep building a life together, who learned that love is not just a feeling but a series of actions, of small kindnesses and grand gestures, of cooking dinner and patching wounds and standing side by side against whatever trouble comes. It was the story of Juliana jumping up to serve the moment Xavier walked in, and Xavier saying, "Sit down. Tonight I will cook." It was the story of a cowboy who stopped drifting and a woman who learned to accept help. It was the story of a boarding house that became a home, of dreams that became reality, of love that lasted. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask how they met, Xavier and Juliana would smile at each other with the secret knowledge of people who have built a life together. And they would tell the story of a May evening in 1882, when a wounded cowboy stumbled into a boarding house and found not just shelter but his entire future. They would tell about the first meal cooked together, about standing up to trouble side by side, about falling in love in less than a week and staying in love for a lifetime. And the grandchildren would listen wide-eyed, thinking it sounded like a fairy tale. But Xavier and Juliana knew better. It was not a fairy tale. It was something far more valuable and rare. It was a true story of real love, hard work, and two people who chose each other every single day. It was the story of a life well lived, of dreams fulfilled, of a love that built something lasting in the wild Oklahoma territory that would eventually become a state. As they grew old together, Xavier and Juliana never forgot that first night, never took for granted the miracle of having found each other. And on quiet evenings, they would still sit on their porch swing, watching the sunset over still water, grateful for every moment they had together and eager for every moment still to come. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy of love and hard work that would continue through their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of two people who decided to stop running and start building, who learned that sometimes home is not a place but a person, and that the greatest adventure is not in drifting but in staying, in planting roots and watching them grow into something beautiful. Their love story was not the kind that ended with riding off into the sunset. It was the kind that continued through the sunset and the sunrise and all the ordinary, extraordinary days in between. It was the kind of love that cooked dinner after a long day, that patched wounds both physical and emotional, that built a business and raised children, and turned a rough frontier boarding house into a home filled with warmth and welcome. It was the kind of love that lasted, and that was the most beautiful thing of all.